Welcome. This is Reverend Yarkanan of the Ministry of Alpha to Omega. In this sermon, we're going to talk about why does God permit suffering? This is an age-old question that's been asked by many people, and unfortunately, it's one of the things that prevents a lot of people from developing a spiritual relationship, following a religion, or thinking of anything as divine. They say such things as, if there was a God or a supreme being overseeing all of us, why would he or she permit suffering in the world? A better question to ask is, why does God limit suffering? Because if you could always say, it could always be worse, if that's true, and God's the one that permits the suffering, then he's also holding back. He's limiting suffering. But nobody ever wants to acknowledge that. There's always a higher level of suffering that could be present in a person, in the universe, in the world. So if God maximized suffering, you would look around the world and say, things really can't get worse. And ultimately, God would be permitting all suffering. And I don't think any creator, force, spirit, benevolent, or even malevolent would do that. And that's not what God does. God permits suffering, but he limits suffering. And he does it out of love with good reason. So, in order to explain why God permits suffering, I'm going to reference one of my favorite science fiction novels. It's called The End of Eternity, appropriately so named for a religious sermon, by Isaac Asimov, who is one of the best science fiction writers of all time. So if I could briefly entertain you with the plot of this book, you could better understand why God permits suffering. So in this book, The End of Eternity, there's a form of time travel that permits people to basically go into another dimension that's timeless. And within that dimension, they could insert themselves into any point of time in the world. So groups of Eternals develop, and their mission is to interfere with humanity to try to create what they think the best outcome possible. And they do this in such a way to create minimal side effects. You take a pebble, you drop it in a pond, the so-called ripple effect. So they want to minimize the ripples, and that's how they go about their business. And anytime somebody invents something that could possibly lead to war or trouble, they alter history so the invention never happened. And they do things like that. So eventually the protagonist is visited, unbeknownst to him, from a woman in the far, far, far future. And she says that the way that these Eternals were limiting humanity is such that it takes them a very long time to develop space travel. And when they go out and travel in space, they basically find out that all the real estate, all the planets to colonize are taken. And they have to stay at Earth, even though they know that they have the possibility of going elsewhere. And then eventually that breaks the heart of humanity so bad that the species goes extinct. So what happens is that the protagonist and his girlfriend, they end up destroying eternity and time travel, and the book ends with the inception of the atomic bomb. And the hidden message is that the development of something so terrible as nuclear war, nuclear bombs, eventually could lead to something fruitful like time travel, similar to military engineering, which is the first branch of engineering that was ever invented, followed by civil engineering, led to many inventions and things that keep us alive and promote life today. You're taking a negative and making it a positive. So these Eternals were trying to limit suffering and violence and things like that in their own eyes. And in doing so, they created a mediocre race that eventually couldn't flourish. They didn't let them toughen themselves. They didn't let them learn. They didn't let them make mistakes. And the book illustrates that. And that's the gist of the book and how it relates to this. So if you want to think of each individual human or humanity as a sculpture that's constantly getting molded, you need to break off pieces of that sculpture. You need to hammer pieces off. You need to create forms. That's a violent process. You're breaking and shattering rock. And a hammer is used to do that. So if we do that to make a sculpture, we citizens are disciplined by the penal system. It's supposed to make them better, but a punishment with the intent of improving something is discipline, and that's what punishment for children is supposed to be. If you don't punish your children, they're not going to grow up to be good people. They'll be mediocre at best, or very selfish, bad people to be around at worst. So with these very ordinary earthly examples of hardship and suffering designed to improve, why would we expect anything less of a creator or supreme being, divinity, force of nature to us? If it loved us, would it not chastise us and punish us and discipline us in an effort to try to improve us, to improve our character, to improve our spirituality, make us stronger, enable us to learn? A young kid, they have to touch the hot stove and burn themselves to learn not to touch the hot stove. If there is no pain in doing that, they'd never appreciate or learn that the stove is hot and they shouldn't touch it. Another concept that's going back to the eternity concept, in Buddhism and Hinduism, there's a concept called samsara, Samsara, and that's the seemingly endless cycle of birth and rebirth, birth and reincarnation, guided by the unseen force of karma. And you build up your karma, you build up to better lives, and eventually you become enlightened, which frees you of this cycle. And they don't really say what happens after you free yourself of this cycle, but it's like an unknown thing. Buddhists say that they don't want to promise of heaven or anything like that would distract somebody from their earthly responsibilities and duties. In Christianity, people tend to have endured great hardships before they come to Christ and ask Him to be their personal Lord and Savior. If they were having a good time their whole lives and didn't suffer any negative consequences, they would probably never do that. They would never turn away from their lives. So it's almost like you could have a good time for a while, but like a hangover, it's eventually going to catch up with you. Now, a more secular example, take somebody who wants to become a distinguished scientist, a woman, who would probably be harder for a female to, go through the ladders of science to become a scientist than a male. So she goes through years of diligent study, gets into the best universities, recommendations, research grants, very punishing academically and mentally to learn all these things. And eventually she becomes self-actualized and maybe one of the best scientists in the world. But to get there was a fair degree of punishment, direct punishment, thinking, studying, using your brain. If you've ever been to school, and I'm sure you have, you can attest to, while it's not akin to physical pain, that it's definitely hard work. And somebody who is self-disciplined to become something better, they need that discipline. They need to not enjoy, but to be able to resist or not succumb to the punishments and the stress in trying to become something great. Think of somebody who's given something for free. Let's just take the only child who's spoiled. They're given everything their entire life. They never had to earn it. are they going to appreciate it once they have it? If they're given that $40,000 car on their 16th birthday, what are the chances of them wrecking that car compared to the other teenager who worked at Subway for 5 summers and bought their own car and paid for it? And how are they going to treat that car? When you earn something, you appreciate it. You understand it more. You remember the steps, the pain and hardship. It makes you remember. It drives the core lessons through you, and it solidifies you at the end with those hurtful, painful memories. But you wear them as a badge of pride inside because you knew what it takes. You know what it takes to get there. And suffering is permitted by God, that's for sure. But it's limited and taken off in ways that you can't see. The Godhead, the force of God, it does intervene in cases to release suffering, to make suffering stop, or to guide people away from certain types of suffering, and for people to enter in some types of suffering that's eventually going to strengthen them. The power of God is to do something so subtle as to make you think that you did it by yourself. But we've all been in instances where we had thoughts or we made certain decisions and we can't quite explain where these ideas came from and why we all of a sudden changed our mind. And when ideas, the nature of ideas and thought itself, things just seem to come out of nowhere. But sometimes they actually do come from somewhere. And you would have to probably look back after the fact to realize that maybe something gave you a suggestion. The beauty of it is that you always have the choice to take that suggestion, whether it be directly from yourself or indirectly to yourself through God. You always have a choice. You always have free will. So there's no way that we could have 100% free will without God permitting some suffering, because free will is what gets us in trouble to begin with. And just like that book, The End of Eternity, if every time we were about to make a bad decision or something bad would happen, God would intervene, and that's what makes things mediocre. So the gist of it is in order to have free will and growth, you have to have suffering. It's as simple as no pain, no gain. You can understand that in terms of a workout, but for some reason, in terms of God and souls and when people die and diseases, it's too heartbreaking to imagine anything benevolent that would permit that. And I feel for those people that think that. And it's hard to look at suffering as a blessing, but it really is. And if you start to digest some of these concepts, you might come to the same conclusion. Or you could continue to resent the forces of what is that we have suffering in our world. But our universe is better because God permits suffering. But remember, when God permits suffering, he also limits it. And there's an old saying, I can't remember if this is in the Bible or not, that God will never give you more than you can bear. And I'm not sure if that's in scripture or if it's just a saying, and I might argue against that, because sometimes the suffering is crushing and it's really about how long it takes you to get up. So you can't bear it and you fall down and it's too much, and it's maybe God doesn't allow more suffering than you can take and still get up at the end of the day. So I want to end not with a prayer, but some song lyrics. The introductory slide there had a cut of this song. It's called Quick Canal by Atlas Sound. Quick Canal refers to a quick way to sainthood or wisdom, and this song is professing a message similar to mine. It goes, I wanted to live the life of a prince, because I thought saints were born saints. So indeed, we didn't stand a chance. Insalubrious offshoots of nature, with heart and mind of our own, all the daughters, all the sons, taking centuries to unearth the creature, heralding a stage where consciousness is higher, taken through a costly process of success and failure. I thought saints were born saints. I looked in the dirt and found wisdom is learnt through a costly process of success and failure. Oh, wisdom is learnt. So nobody values the truly, truly wise man or woman because they've endured lots of pain and suffering. So rejoice and try to be happy about the suffering if possible, and try to grow from it. Peace be with you. May the force be with you.